Welcome to this week's episode of Being Human. I'm here with Tim Jackson. He's the author of two books, Prosperity Without Growth and Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism, which is the one I just finished reading this morning. He's also the lead of a research centre at the University of Surrey in the UK, the Centre for Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity. Tim, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here, Richard. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. So I have to say, when my visceral reaction to that title, post-growth, as somebody who's actively engaged in capitalism and entrepreneurialism, it's sort of quite unsettling, this thought that, but growing companies, that's part of what makes our societies dynamic and creative. And the idea that we should just stop that sort of fills me with fear and sort of visions of a socialist dystopia. And yet, I read this book and so much of it makes sense and sort of speaks to my heart. So, it's interesting for people. I wonder if we should start with just laying out what we mean by post-growth, especially for those who it might strike some fear into.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it is referring, very specifically to the kind of model of economic growth. And you mentioned Prosperity Without Growth, which was a book that I wrote when I was Economics Commissioner for the UK Sustainable Development Commission. So it's a report to government, actually, at the time. And it was very uncomfortable for them, as you can imagine, to have an advisory body sort of turning around and saying, hang on, guys, you should question economic growth. When, of course, that expansion of the economy, the indicator of the gross domestic product, the GDP, is at the forefront of every politician's mind. At one point, actually, it was after the book was published, but when Cameron was Prime Minister, he said, I'm going to put every department in my government on a war footing in pursuit of growth. This is all we do. This is all that government does. So it comes as a bit of a shock to the system. And there's several reasons really for thinking about things differently, thinking about post-growth. First, the most obvious is that if you keep expanding your planet, you can't expand your planet. If you keep expanding your economy indefinitely, and your planet is defiantly not expanding to meet that, then, expanding economy meets finite planet. And you kind of see what we're seeing at the moment: climate change, loss of biodiversity, plastics in the ocean, every single part of the planet somehow attacked by the detritus of human activity. And that's something we haven't come to terms with properly. And that was really the basis of my analysis in Prosperity Without Growth, and thinking about how far you could use technology to get around that, how far you could use efficiency to get around it, whether capitalism set up well to get around it, and so on and so forth. That book was written around about the time of the financial crisis, 12 years ago now, 13 years ago almost. And it was at its time, as I say, it was shocking. But since then, actually, the conversations moved quite a long way and in quite interesting ways. And one of the interesting things that's happened is that we've begun to realize that in the advanced economies, economic growth has actually been slowing down for several decades. And within a few decades, we could well be in a post-growth economy. And yet we don't have an economics to think about that. We don't have a politics to think about that. We don't have a sense of progress that includes that idea. So that was a part of my reason really for writing Post-Growth, following up on the 10 years since that original analysis, and kind of thinking, actually, there's a lot of tough thinking to be going on. This is not a technical issue it's not just an economic issue. It's not just about policy proposals. It's a whole new mindset, as you were kind of suggesting. It's a challenge to our assumptions about what companies are, what societies are, and what we are as people. And that was the challenge that I wanted to address in the book.
Yeah, and I think you've said something there. You've drawn a distinction between growth and progress, and I think that's an important one, right? And you get into that in the book, and specifically this distinction between work and labor. And I see that as a parallel, right? Just we might labor, and that might contribute to a growth in GDP, but that's very different to work and potentially, the growth and progress of our own development as humans. I wonder if we sort of start there as a way to juxtapose progress and growth.
Yeah, that is an interesting comparison actually to that because I see that comparison between work and labour slightly differently, but I do think it has a sort of parallel. You're right, but let's address that question of distinguishing growth and progress first, because I think it's really important. And actually, when I was writing Prosperity Without Growth back in the day, that was my starting point. Is when you look at the meaning of the word prosperity, even its origins in terms of language, it means pro speres, in pursuit of or in accordance with our hopes. So prosperity is about having a good life that's in accordance with our hopes and aspirations. It's not about growth and accumulation for its own sake. And the word has only recently been sort of annexed by our society to kind of mean prosperity equals economic growth. It's, historically that just wasn't the case. And in the roots of the word, it shows it isn't either. So that idea of thinking, pulling those things apart is very important. But let's talk about this distinction between work and labour, because I think it's a fascinating one. I don't know. I'd have to think about it more carefully, I think, to see whether it maps onto that distinction between growth and prosperity. Because for Hannah Arendt, who is the philosopher whose work I was drawing on in that chapter, the distinction between labour and work is that labour is that sort of, intense, visceral stuff that we have to do to get by, to feed ourselves, to clean ourselves, to look after our kids, to look after our elderly people, the work of care for each other, and indeed, to some extent, care for the planet itself, potentially. And it has this kind of, for Arendt, it has this sort of visceral quality to it. You work, you labour, and it's the sweat of your brow that brings you the temporary achievements that allows you to temporarily satisfy your appetite for food or nutrition or shelter or something. And you know that you're going to have to start again tomorrow, because that never, ever stops. So it has this sort of sense of a continual natural process that all animals, all species have to labor to get the energy they require to live, and then to get through the next day. And then when your labor is over, you have this period of rest and rejuvenation before it all begins again. And what Aaron says about that, which I think is really fascinating, is that, perhaps that's our only true happiness, lies in that regenerative act of laboring to care for ourselves and the recovery from it, and being totally immersed in that process. Now, having made that definition of labor and what we as humans do in the processes of labor, she then says, what we've done partly through technology, partly through progress, we have given ourselves a space to rise above that visceral process of exhaustion and regeneration that labor is about. Partly because we become more productive at making food. We don't have to work so long to get it. So we've got all this time on our hands. And what happens? We lift our eyes from that exhaustive process. And what do we see? We see our own mortality. We see the temporariness of our existence. We see the fact that we're going to die. We see the fact that the civilization is only a temporary thing. And we want to resist that. And so what we try to do to resist that is to create a kind of a human world, of the world, the artifice of a human world that goes beyond that temporary regenerative process of labor, which ultimately ends in death. And we try to create permanence. And so that work, in a sense, is this process of trying to find a strategy to deal with our own mortality. So we create things, we build things, we hope that they're durable, that they'll last longer than us. And even if they don't, at least they go beyond that sort of very visceral regenerative process of the everyday toil and into a space which allows us to create extraordinary visions of human progress in a way. Right. So I'd sort of agree that it does map onto that sense of what progress is. And in a sense, work is essential for us to be able to get to that space where progress is even a meaningful thing to talk about.
Right. Yeah. And so is part of your, a vision for a post-growth, progressful, if that's a word, society, is that...
you could call it progressive, but then people might misunderstand us. Might be different. So purposeful, definitely. Yeah.
Purposeful, certainly.
Yeah.
would that be one based on work that sort of elevates work? And
I think interestingly, the point is that to some extent we've trashed both labor and work in capitalism, and we've done it in very specific ways. First of all, labor is intensive of human time, and so in chasing productivity, and especially the productivity of human time, we've left a whole sector of our society, the people who labor in society, who really do still labor, the carers, social carers, the people who build and renovate, and that sort of part of the economy that Aaron called labor, have been the ones whose livelihoods have been most precarious, whose wages have been lowest, who've had the lowest status in society, and to some extent kind of left behind by our vision of progress. And so one of the remedies, I think, and I think it's a really important remedy, because when you think about the lessons of the pandemic, that was the sector of society that mattered the most to us, the people who saved our lives quite literally in hospitals, the people who, made sure that we could live and eat and get from day to day. That sector of the population had been left behind by capitalism in a quite precise way, by this sort of chasing of labor productivity, of the productivity of human time. And there's certain kinds of tasks that don't respond well to that. And care, for example, is one of them. So one of my prescriptions is actually that we have to re-elevate the idea of care, a part of that sense of labor, into the center of the economy, and give it back its place in terms of the importance to us of the quality of our lives, and indeed for our sense of progress. But the second part of it is that capitalism has also undermined the concept of work. And this is really fascinating, because you'd think, we're all working fantastically productively, we're doing all this stuff, it must be having some impact. But if you go back to Aaron's point about what work is for, that sense of creating a durable world for us, durability is inimical to capitalism. Capitalism does not like things that last, because if they last, then there's no demand for new things. So you can't turn over and over this new markets, new products, new services to sell to people over and over again if things are too durable. So in fact, what you see is that both labor, which has been denigrated under capitalism, and work, which relies on, or which is trying to construct durability, and durability is inimical to capitalism, both of those things have suffered, I am saying, under our existing economic system. And both of them actually have to be re-elevated to their original purposes.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And when you think about putting, because the way I see I see work is like putting our love into the activity that we're doing. We're putting our heart and soul in it. We're putting our mark on it. And of course, that activity, work in that way, most of us in capitalism, not all, but most of us don't have the ability to do that, right? And that seems to me...
I think that is a really interesting point. And I think, and to some extent, I think it can tie together those two things, labor and work, because, in an ideal world, that is what both of those things should be. They should be things that we love doing, things that we put ourselves into, which we identify ourselves with. And in the right conditions, I think they are. So actually, it's really fascinating that amongst the most fulfilled workers are those who are working in those poorly regarded sectors, like caring for other people, because carers do put themselves and their love for the world and for others into their jobs, and that provides a sense of fulfillment. So there, and as you say, the work side of things, that the labor or the work of creativity is something where you can invest yourself, you can invest your vision, you can invest your purpose, and you can identify with. And I think so I guess I'm agreeing with you. I guess I'm saying, yes, I think that's right, that work itself has kind of lost its sense, lost its way, across the board in the modern economy. And actually the Schumacher, who wrote The Small is Beautiful some 30 years ago, he kind of said almost exactly the same thing. He sort of said, we've been so busy chasing productivity that work is seen as a cost to producers, and it's seen as a sacrifice to people who work itself. And so the meaning and purpose of work has got lost. And bringing that back, makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and I see some rays of hope in that respect when you look at the Etsy ecosystem. This is a world of creators who are engaged in work as we've just defined it, right? They're creating something that's going to go potentially last beyond their lifetime. They are creating durable items of art that are functional in the world. And even in the mass produced economies, you see, to what extent this is, meaningful, I guess we can question, but that there are certain garments, manufacturers now where the individuals who've worked on them will sign their name, in the pair of jeans or whatever it might be. And so you see some of this coming through, but the economy at large is not organized in that way.
No. I mean, it is it is a challenging thought. I remember when Prosperity Without Growth, the former book, was published, that my father turned around to me, and he had spent his whole life in the manufacturing sector, really, in electronics. I mean, he was doing the research behind the product innovation that would lead to, the new markets and in manufacturing. And he kind of said to me, this is really challenging to me. I've got to rethink everything that I've approached work through before, because I've seen work as being this relationship between a creative process and material stuff in the world in order to produce material products which you can then sell. And that is how, at its best, in a sense, that kind of creative process of manufacturing has progressed. But then if you put the lens of a finite world on top of that, that's the point at which I think you have to start rethinking. Yeah, that's fine. We can have that creative process. We can keep that creativity. We're still necessarily dealing with some materials. We can't do without materials, but we've got to think in terms of, the value of the product being much more about the service it has to other human beings, rather than simply the mass marketing of a very attractive product that lots of people are going to buy and throw away as fast as possible. You've really got to turn that relationship between materials and the quality of service they provide and our own creativity on its head, and prioritize really that sense of service and creativity as the elements of good work.
Yeah, I can see that. So that there is it's not just about the individual engaged in work. You've got to also apply that broader lens on, what are the materials that individual's using? What's the impact on the broader society? Yeah, I can see that. And something that comes to mind, which I like that you introduce in the book, the work of Shalom Schwartz, right? And this idea of, we're in this. Well, he views, I suppose, our human experience along these two axes, tradition, novelty, and other and self. And what I liked and resonated for me is that the entrepreneur, which right now society obviously, celebrates, is very much in that quadrant of novelty and self, right? That it's about how can I get rich and how can I produce, new products for the market, and for that individual that maybe work for them, but for society as a whole that might cause us problems.
Yeah, just thinking about, yes, I think that's right, that mostly entrepreneurs would be seen in that selfish innovation, novelty-seeking, selfish segment. But actually, it's quite interesting, the emergence of social entrepreneurship, for example, and the ideas of social innovation suggest that actually you could be shifting into that selfless side, or the social side of entrepreneurship within Schwartz's sort of map of the human psyche. And interestingly, actually, a few years ago, a student of mine did a study of, what kind of motivates entrepreneurs. And, you'd think the typical answer to that might be, well, it's money, or it's success, or it's, personal status, which of course are there. There's no denying that's there for all of us in a sense. But there was also something really we didn't expect that came through that, which was the primary motivations were not about expansion and money, but actually about, having some role in society, creating a role in society and even being of service in society. And we did another study of young people and their sort of hopes and aspirations for the future and their fears for the future. And again, we came up with this really interesting finding that there was lots around, security, we'll have a good job, we'll have good status. And then there's this undertone, quite a strong undertone of, please, whatever else I do, I want to have social agency. I want to be able to act in society and be a creditable person in society. And I think this is a strong motivation, and it's a social motivation, I would argue. So it falls less in that sort of, selfish, novelty-seeking, hedonist side of Schwartz's diagram, and a little bit more, I think we have to see it actually, and we have to see it as a primary motivation in human beings to be social, to become social, to be embedded, to participate in society. And again, for me, that sort of evidence, and I think it's quite strong evidence, provides, a sense of hope that we could put that back at the center of our vision of progress.
Right. And to what extent did where were they plotted in terms of traditional versus novelty seeking, and how much does a return to tradition play in our need, or in creating sustainable economies?
We didn't test that with that particular parameter in either of those studies, but it's a really good idea for a study, which I'm going to go away now and find a student somewhere who would like to do that, because I think it's a really good idea. I don't know is the answer. I mean, typically you're right that entrepreneur spirit has been seen as kind of at the frontier of novelty seeking, and less bound by kind of tradition and conservation in Schwartz's sense. So, and perhaps that's why, that entrepreneurial spirit does actually have to be balanced by institutions and by behaviors and norms that ground us in our tradition, that think about, the long term in the future, but also the long term going back into our past, connecting us between our past, our present, and our future. And I talk about this a little bit, of course, in the bit of the book, the chapter in the book where I'm talking about investment and talking about prudence and this old concept of prudence, which actually. And there's a lovely painting that I describe in the book of the allegory of prudence by Titian, and it's a painting of a kind of young man looking forwards, an old man looking backwards, and then a sort of man in his middle years. I'm sorry that they're all men, but that was, I guess, was Titian's kind of mores at the time, sort of looking out at the camera. And what he kind of suggests in the picture, and what the concept of prudence suggests to us, is that being in the present and acting properly in the present, being prudent in the present, entails looking forwards, of course, into the results of our actions today, but also looking into the past and understanding where we've come from, where society has come from, where our values are grounded, where our roots are. And that those two things together, the past and the future, connect in a way that enables us to act in a prudent way in the present. In fact, to be truly present, in a sense, we have to have those characteristics of looking back as well as looking forwards. And that would, I don't know whether there's I guess that, you could probably apply that to entrepreneurship. You could probably argue that, a successful entrepreneur knows where they've come from as well as where they're going to, and that might actually provide for a more grounded sense of entrepreneurship. Or it might be that entrepreneurship is just that, relentless novelty-seeking, taking risks thing. And we also need the people who are stable and centered and thinking about tradition and grounded in care for our kids. And that's what keeps society together. We need that stuff as well in society.
Well, I wonder if it's about, because you're right, maybe that individual entrepreneur might be highly selfish and novelty-seeking, but that might be okay, as you say, if they're constrained in some way. And I can't help thinking, whenever we get into these conversations about sustainability, say the Amish or these very traditional communities, right, who seem, at least on the face of it, to be models for sustainable living, right? That they're highly constrained, and you can imagine the entrepreneurial spirits in individuals in those societies,
being repressed.
Being repressed, but arguably in a healthy way for society, which is an interesting idea,
Possibly,
especially for somebody for me who values that freedom. And
Mary Douglas was a big critic of the idea in fact, early on, she was a critic of the idea of kind of sustainability and ecological sort of activism, because she saw it precisely as repressive. And she saw what modern society had done was to actually free ourselves from some of those repressions. And she pointed out, and it's really important to point it out, that very closed, traditional, overly conservative communities, conservationist communities, are not nice places to live, particularly if you are that kind of restless entrepreneur who's trying to do something exciting and be creative. You're bound by those social mores in the same way that they provide a sort of grounding for society. They also clamp down on its creativity if they're applied too oppressively. So it brings us back, I suppose, to one of the other themes in the book, which is this idea of balance. And, the balance between those different things, the balance between kind of creative restlessness and traditional and conservation and safety is important for a healthy society, just as the balance between selfishness and altruism is important in that society.
Right. And how do we, because of course, traditionally it was, the institutions that would play that role, it would be the family, it would be the church, and those, to some extent, those institutions have been challenged, in this era of modern capitalism. Where do you see the sources for that, if you like, healthy restraint, coming from?
Yeah, it is true. And there's a wonderful book called The Challenge of Affluence, I think it's called, by Avner Offer, where he makes that case that as we've developed as a society and we've created all these freedoms, we've lost these devices, which he calls commitment devices, which allow us to rein in our individuality and bring back sociality, to rein in our kind of constant desire for instant gratification and defer some of that gratification into the future. So these devices that make us more long-term on the one hand and less selfish on the other hand are really important parts of the structure of society. And I think I don't have an easy answer to your question, but if you think of all of those institutions and those commitment devices as being eroded, then you have to begin to think about what can bring that back. And I think that's partly a kind of internal journey that every individual actually is probably a wholer, saner, more fulfilled person if they embody that balance rather than push themselves into one or other of the extremes. And I think that's possible. I think that individual process of becoming more fully human by balancing these tensions within yourself is something that everybody can do. But it's also clear, of course, that when you've got a society that is incentivizing you to be a selfish, novelty-seeking hedonist in order to, buy all the goods that we need people to buy, because otherwise there's no work for anyone. When that's happening in society, it's very, very hard to keep that balance. And that's That's another of the sort of central parts of the book, in a way, that in its pursuit of the idea that more is always better, we've created institutions that push people out of that balance. So we've got to rein that. So that individual process, I think, it works. It's there. It's available for everyone individually to pursue. But we've got to think again, in social terms, about the structures that push people out of balance, and do something about those. And I think those are partly, that's partly about reining in this relentless power that the market has, and the government, in its role in setting the rules of the market, also has to push us out of balance, and also perhaps building up those institutions, not necessarily in quite the same way that provided that balance in the past. So, institutions that support solidarity in society, that support sociality, that draw us together in common endeavors. And that may not be, old style religious churches, which we have lost our kind of affinity for in some way, but it must probably be something that replaces the functions that once had.
Yeah. And as you say that, I can sort of feel, to some extent, the fear rising in me of sort of, the tendency sometimes that those institutions can have towards sort of tipping in towards authoritarianism and sort of heavy-handed repression. And yet I could absolutely see, as we talk, the need for some level of repression of that individual impulse. It's a,
there's another, I think,
it's a tension there.
You talk about it, Richard, as repression, but what if we talk about it as integration instead, as solidarity? Because I think that's, I talk about this film that in the book called The Witness, which is a Peter Weir film, Australian director. And he goes into the Amish community with that film, actually. He has Harrison Ford go in there as the wounded police officer who's just rescued the young boy who's the witness in the film. And they hole up in this Amish community. And there's a scene in that film where he definitely shows the repression that exists in the Amish community. He doesn't shy away from that. But then he also has this scene, which is the barn raising scene, where the whole community comes together once a year to put up this, to renovate its structures, to do its work together. And there's this scene where they're just raising this barn, building a barn out of wood, and everybody is playing a role in that process. Everybody is involved in that. Every generation is involved in some task, whether it's the banging of the wood together or the cutting or the lifting, or or feeding, doing the labor of feeding the people who are doing the work of creating the barn. And it's a very visual analogy for what Aaron was talking about. But it also brings out this sociality that work can provide, in the sense that when we're engaged in a common task together, we're not repressed, and yet we're not entirely individualistic either. And I think that kind of, working together is, in a way, it's the place where that kind of fear of repression can be shifted a little bit, even as we move away from the thoroughly sort of individualistic idea of personal creativity and personal task. And, how does that feel in your sense?
Yeah. A bomb. No, it's but I like that framing, right? That just seems like, at least in my sensibilities.
Barn obviously is a metaphor. We're talking. It's a visual metaphor in Weir's film for that common spirit, and the best of that common spirit coming together in a common task. But there are other common tasks, for example, that equally important.
Yeah. And and I like that term, integration. So there's the integration of the individual with the group in, engaged in a particular activity, as you just described. But also the story I love is, of this lady from Kenya,
Wangari Maathai.
And the Mugumu Tree. But that seemed to be, I'll let you tell a story, but that seems to be like an integration almost between the individual and the myths of the culture.
Yeah, I mean, it is very interesting. It's also an integration, of course, between people and planet. So the Mugumu tree is this kind of fig tree that grows in the highlands of Kenya. And when she was a child, Wangari Maathai, who became the founder of the Greenbelt movement, which planted trees all over Africa and eventually all over the world, learned from her mother that when she was collecting wood, she shouldn't collect the wood from this Mugumo tree. And she asks her mother why, because the Mugumo tree provides life, and it was associated with the deity of the local deity in the tribal tongue, and therefore should not be touched. And then Wangari Maathai accepts all this. She goes out and she collects water from the stream, and she collects wood, but not from where the Mugumo trees are planted. And then she goes out into the world and she kind of learns about ecology. She's actually one of what's called the Kennedy airlift of the Kenyan teenagers who were basically taken from Kenya and educated in the US. And then she comes back to Kenya. She goes back to her local village, and she sees all the Mugumo trees have gone and the streams have dried up and there's no more vegetation there. And it's a kind of barren place because they cut it all down to plant tea plantations, which has basically ruined the ecology. And the point about it is that simple myth that her mother had encoded her in a kid was a protection against the value that the Mugumo tree represented in ecological terms. It has these deep roots. It goes down through the rock, so it gets down to the groundwater. The groundwater then can spring up through these springs that come up into the earth, and that water then makes the vegetation lush around where the Mugumo trees are planted. It has an ecological function that is of huge value to human beings and to the communities who lived there. And all of that just got wiped out, got trashed by capitalism coming in and planting tea, because that was a lucrative product that provided export payments that would bring Kenya supposedly out of poverty and into the modern world, if we believe the best of that myth. And it went wrong because it neglected that simple message that was coded into a local myth that we break the connection between ourselves and the earth at our peril.
Yeah. The accumulated wisdom of that community as held in the myths. And we don't, that's what it seems to me that we've eroded in this modern era of capitalism, is this, the accumulated, wisdom, of our cultures. It's like the questions we ask we don't start on a capitalistic project with the question of how do we honor our culture? We start with how much money can we make for our shareholders? Yeah. It's just sort of gone from the psyche, isn't it?
And it's interesting to speculate. I mean, again, it's about asking ourselves and almost feeling our way through what would it be like if we put some of that back. It goes right back to that idea that tradition provided for the conservation, and that myth supported the Mugumo trees, which provided for a lush landscape in which people could live. When you lose that root, when you cut it off, then you lose the wisdom that's associated with it. And so kind of going back and finding the places where actually we need to reinstate not necessarily the same myths. We don't have to believe that the fig tree represents a deity in our society, but actually now that we have a wider knowledge actually of the scientific knowledge of what that relationship is, how we can use that to anchor ourselves into a better relationship to the planet. I think that's a fantastically creative task to engage in.
Yeah. And I think that's right. But I think what's interesting to me is, even if I reflect on this story, I sort of scan my own memory and thoughts for what similar myths was I exposed to, as a kid. And I literally can't think of any. And I think that's illustrative of where we're at. Yeah.
Yeah. We're always kind of rushing forwards, looking forwards, innovating constantly, and thinking about this restless future. And I mean, when you think about what we're, never mind your generation or my generation, but our kids' generation, that sense, there is a sense, I think, of a sort of great acceleration that's being driven forward by that. And therefore a real need, I think, to find the places where we can anchor ourselves in a bit of at least reflection on the meaning and the importance of those traditions.
Right. Yeah. And reflection comes through, throughout this book as something that's important. And what's interesting about the book, I suppose, is you're an economist, and this has a very poetic feel, very reflective feel. You use a lot of poetry in the book. And is that part of this solution? Is sort of spending time in reflection, in poetry? Talk a little bit about I suppose it's a new attitude in some ways.
I think it is. It's, in some ways, it's a very personal book, Post-Growth, because it was partly at least about bringing two halves of myself together. This kind of academic economist side, which had been, at the heart of government policy, at the heart of problems of sustainability, teaching my kids, professing as professors are supposed to do, about, important theories and backing them up with scientific evidence. And I'm not dissing that process. Of course, it's really important. But it is only a part of how we see the world and relate to it. And actually, just as it happens, before I was an economist, I was a playwright. I wrote radio plays for the BBC and continued to do it while I was an economist for a while. And that's a very, very different process. And one of the things, for example, that you can do when you're a playwright, which you can't do if you're a professor, is that you can have characters who speak with completely different voices. People who don't see the world as you as a professor see the world, people who argue against your own positions. When I'm professing, I have to defend my argument and publish papers to defend my argument and get peer reviewers to critique it and then defend against their critiques. And it's a very intellectual left brain activity. And yet we're not fundamentally just left brain creatures. We are as much or more right brain creatures. And that's where our inspiration comes from. It's where our creativity comes from. It's where our vision for the future comes from. And so what I had done, my personal history is I'd held those two things separately. I'd held ecological economics here, in my day job. And I'd found my sanity in being able to write plays for the BBC, on the other hand, and I'd kind of held them apart from each other. And that's why Post-Growth is kind of so personal in a sense, because I made a sort of conscious decision actually to bring them, to see what would happen if I brought them together again. And what happened was more of a sense of storytelling, the telling of the stories of the individuals that we've talked about, Hannah Arendt and Wangari Maathai and Robert Kennedy and John Stuart Mill and various others who populate the book in order to carry humanity, to bring humanity into economics in a very tangible way for people to understand, but also to bring that sense of the creative, that sense of the poetic, to move away from the stringent prison of kind of mathematical formulae and policy predictions, and to argue. And I think this is where economics comes from, that the way that we organize the economy, the way that we organize society is a moral issue and an emotional issue as much as it is a scientific and rational issue. And to neglect that is to make economics actually a less powerful thing. And to bring it back is to make economics into a richer, fuller description of how we can approach the world. And that was very much, that's very much a part of what I wanted to do in the book. And at the same time, hopefully, to use those as tools to make economics and economic ideas accessible to more people. Yeah.
And that makes a lot of sense. And part of me, as you say that, thinks, well, hang on, why don't we leave the economists doing economics? And actually the way to solve that is to bring more ethicists and moralists and, philosophers into the public discourse and integrate them in that way. But in some ways, that's just more of the same, right? It's this, siloed thinking, right? That's more of right brain and left brain independently. But actually, perhaps the idea here is to bring humanity, into economics and for that matter, any of these other sort of scientific realms.
Yeah. I mean, I think again, it's like the thing we were talking about with, the individual and social. You could do both things. Obviously, you could. I think if you balance your governance, for example, with that sense of the ethical and the moral and the social, then it's safe enough to leave the things slightly separate from each other. And that you do have economists who are looking at the budget and do understand, macroeconometric forecasting or whatever is probably still something you might want somewhere in your process. But I also, I kind of think that economics itself would still benefit from remembering its origins as a moral philosophy, and if you, as soon as you forget that, as soon as you start seeing economics actually as a kind of standalone, self-justifying, hard science of behavior and the future, that's the point where all the dangers come from, because you forget that behind all of the assumptions in the economic models lie moral positions which are not defined, not open for inspection, and therefore not open to question. And that's dangerous. That's when it becomes dangerous. That's when it becomes possible for you to trump all of your moral concerns by whether or not the decision that you make in government will promote growth or not. And that's where danger lies.
That's such a profound point, right? That we hide that moral position and we don't inspect it. Yeah, that's so true. We have a conversation about economic growth without any conversation about the morality embedded in that position.
It allows us to make ridiculous decisions. We'll go for we'll install a nuclear power station because it'll be good for nuclear growth. We'll dump the waste in a place which is in 1,000 years or even 100 years is going to be dangerous because we're focusing on growth. We're going to allow the licensing of casinos all across our country because it will promote growth. You take these moral decisions in a hidden way because you're arguing in favor of something in which they are supposed not to matter, and yet they are integral to our lives, those moral aspects, and they change the decisions that you make on an apparently objective basis in promotion of economic growth actually has moral consequences which go deep into our society. You allow companies, modern tech companies, to create their activities in tax havens because that will promote growth. And the kinds of things that you allow them to do with the data that they collect through those tech innovations is unregulated and undermining even our social and political stability as we speak. And also all of that stuff, data analytica, all of that kind of stuff, and the exposure of our kids to technologies whose influences and whose implications we still don't really understand, is all predicated on the defense of economic growth. And that's a dangerous place to be.
Yeah. But and you're right that we don't understand these things. But what's interesting is we allow these activities to continue without even the moral inquiry that might, through an inspection of the wisdom that sits behind some of these decisions, might actually give us some prediction of, well, maybe this is a good idea or a bad idea. But we don't even have that conversation sort of ahead of time. Right?
No, we don't. I mean, exactly. I think ahead of time is exactly where we don't have it. And then a little bit later, there's a kind of catch up. There's a little bit of social backlash. But that conversation is always relegated to, the chattering classes and the broadsheets, and what's happening at the seat of government is actually conversations which are systematically neglecting that moral aspect. And I think that's the part that's particularly wrong and particularly dangerous.
Yeah. I think that's such an important point. So Tim, I know we don't have too much time left with you. I just wonder for for the individual listeners out here, what's your message for individuals in terms of how they lead their life? What are some of the things that you suggest for people who themselves want to bring about a more prosperous, sustainable future?
Yeah. I mean, we touched on it a little bit before, this question of how much the individual can do, and I think it is always possible for the individual to work and to inform themselves and to pursue their lives with this concept of balance at its heart. and this balance between, our selfish motivations, our social motivations, balance between thinking about innovation and thinking about tradition, and the balance also between labor and work in our lives. We tend to think that we should be at that higher earning part of the workforce, which is essentially drawing rents, extracting rents from all the other parts of the economy in order to produce not just wealth, but social status. But actually those bits of the workforce that are about labor, Hannah Arendt's labor, the grounding ourselves in the day-to-day rejuvenation and protection and maintenance and nurturing of human life, actually it's a loss at the individual level to simply continually push yourself or think of yourself as being this hyper creative, novelty seeking entrepreneurial person, and neglecting those tasks which we sort of denigrate to parts of society that then become undervalued. So I think, at the individual level, this balance between these different elements, I think is an important guiding principle. But there's one other element which I want to touch on, which I talk about in the book, which is this suggestion that there are states of being human, really, which are inherently fulfilling, exceedingly creative, and in and of themselves tend to dissolve the boundary between self and other, and between self and task, and between self and planet. And this is this psychological state of flow, which I develop as a kind of theme through the book, because and this draws on our own research actually. And what the research shows is that when you experience this state of flow, and most popularly it's thought of as being what sports people experience when they're really functioning at a high level. They're in a state of flow, and that's the kind of linguistics of it. Then they're somehow, they're just in the zone. And that sense of being in the zone, it seems to me, is something that's accessible to everyone. It's not reliant on you having a huge position in society. It's not reliant on having a huge amount of physical or material or economic resources. It's a state of mind that actually is very democratizing and could provide a sense of vision of what prosperity is and what progress could mean that has gone missing, I think. And the research that we've done, what the research that we've done is fascinating, because it does a couple of things. It sort of says that when you are someone who's more liable to experience this sense of flow, you are likely also to be a less materialistic person. And then there's another bit of research, which was a suggestion made by a psychologist called Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who has done a lot of work around this concept of flow, which sort of says that, these flow-based activities are less material intensive, less environmentally damaging in their nature, because what they call on us to do is to focus our attention around a particular challenge and to develop our skill in meeting that challenge. And that balance between skill and challenge is where this experience of flow comes from. So that's why, for example, sports people do experience it a lot, because playing sports at a high level is very challenging and demands a lot of skill. So when you're in the zone, these things come together, and that skill and challenge are balanced with each other. And out of this emerges this sense of human experience, which is highly conducive to well-being. Good measures which show that people who experience flow are also happier on psychometric measures of their well-being, less materialistic, less use of material activity, and also, this sense of dissolving the boundaries between self and other, of bringing our experiences into a place which allows us to reach that sense of solidarity, to become less materialistic, to be less environmentally damaging potentially as well. And that for me, is a project. That's like a project to create a different vision of what humans can be, a different sense of the journey that we're on, a different vision for prosperity and for progress itself, and one in which everybody can be engaged. We can teach our kids skill to manage challenge in all sorts of different arenas. And we can do that systematically through our lives. At any stage in our life, we can take up that decision. We can make that decision. And that decision empowers us to live fuller, more meaningful, and more sustainable lives.
Wow. I love that. Yeah. That's a very empowering message, as you say, democratizing. Anybody could ask themselves that question: how could I find flow to a greater degree in my life? Whatever my skill level, whatever my age, mobility, immobility, economic resources, right? That's available. Beautiful.
And it's such a, I think, what I love about it is it's so much richer a concept of what it means to do well or what it means to prosper than anything that capitalism has offered us.
Yeah. Absolutely. And purely from the sort of ecological sustainability point, this isn't because so often the message from sort of that camp is, don't do this, deprive yourself of this. But what you're talking about here is something, entirely positive.
Absolutely. This post-growth world is a richer, more fulfilling, more meaningful, more purposeful world. And that's something to hold on to. That's something to fight for.
Yeah. Excellent. Wow. Okay. Thank you, Tim. That was wonderful conversation.
Been a pleasure.
Really enjoyed that. So we'll put a link to the book, Post-Growth Life After Capitalism. With my kids love this sofa, by the way. They're 4.5 years old, and the book's been lying around the house.
That's really good to know. I'm really pleased. I need to know what they like about it so much. There was quite a lot of discussion, as you can imagine, about the picture on the cover, but I like it too.
Yeah, wonderful sofa. And I suppose it's part of the point here. That's but it looks like people have worked on that sofa, not laboured on it, and it looks like it's going to last.
Yeah. Very good.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Well, thanks again, Tim. So we'll put the link to the book. And I guess the other place for people that might want to check it out is your research center. Is there anywhere else you might send people?
That research center has a lot of resources on it. So that's www.cusp.ac.uk, and then there's also some resources which talk about my ecological economics work and also my playwriting on timjackson.org.uk. Thank you for having me on the show.
No, thank you so much.